SoundCartel. In this episode, we talk to Lemonada co-founder Jess Cordova Kramer about how similar family tragedies for both her and her co-founder led to the launch of a fast-growing first-person narrative podcast network that shares unfiltered versions of the human experience.
COVID hit, and it was like, not just statistically likely that you're miserable, but you are miserable. Whether you live in Kenya or Brisbane or New York, you're miserable. And it's really just feeding a need to make things a little bit more joyful. And also brands being like, where are the people we can help with our product or with our services?
I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 16 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
G'day, Nick. Good to be back with you.
Now, a quick warning to listeners that this episode discusses drugs and the fatal impact they can inflict.
It does sound dark, Nick, but this story of two women, strangers, both losing their brothers to drug overdoses does actually have an uplifting message.
Yes, it's an unusual reason to start a podcast network, but it's precisely what our guest, Jessica Cordova Kramer, and her co-founder, Stephanie Wittels Wachs, did. They channeled the pain of their loss into a mission to help others. And now their podcast network, Lemonada Media, is producing podcasts that cover a range of real-world topics and growing a huge audience of loyal listeners along the way. All in an effort, as they say, to make life suck less, one podcast at a time. So, Nick, let's get to Jess for the rest of the story, which is full of lessons for brands and podcasters of all types.
Absolutely. Jessica Cordova Kramer began her professional career as a Wall Street lawyer, but quickly decided it wasn't the life for her, as so many lawyers do. I'll let Jess fill in the gaps for how she made the move to podcasting, but it includes a stint at Crooked Media, producing the award-winning Pod Save the People, before co-founding Lemonada with Stephanie Wittels Wachs.
Welcome, Jess, to Podcasting Essentials.
It's so great to be here.
Hey, Jess. Thank you so much for taking time for us. I'll jump straight in. Jess, you started your career as a Wall Street lawyer. So what motivated you to start a podcast network?
Yeah, the lawyer part, 0 out of 10 recommend. Although I went to NYU for theater school. Right out of high school, went to college, studied theater, thought, wow, this is not going to make me any money and I probably should do something sound. And I decided that when I was 20 years old, applied to law school. I went to law school. I loved law school. It was fantastic. Got to practicing and I was like, you know what? This is not great. And you look around and you're like, what's the prize? And the prize is I'm a partner in a law firm. You're like, ooh, okay. Maybe I should chase something else. I was very young. I was, I think, 23 when I graduated from law school, so I was a child lawyer. And I did it for a few years, and then I thought, I just want to do something different. So I did mission-related work in the education sector, nonprofit management for 12 years, and decided I'd had 2 kids. I got married. I moved across the country from New York, where I'm from, to Minneapolis. I decided I'd take some time off. And then my best friend texted me and was like, I got a podcast with Crooked. Can you help? And I was like, I don't know 90% of what you're asking me, but yes. Sure, I'll help you. And he's a big activist in the Black Lives Matter movement. During McKesson, Crooked, turned out to be Crooked Media. I thought I was signing up to help him answer an email. I didn't know what I was signing up for. And turned out I was the first producer hire for this startup podcast network, having no audio experience, having listened to only one podcast in my life, missing Richard Simmons, at the end of which he was not missing. He was just trying to avoid the producers. But yeah, I really had to figure it out quickly. And that was my foray into podcasting. And then I can talk more about this, but the longest and saddest story short, my little brother, Stefano, passed away about 6 months into making Pod Save the People with DeRay and with Crooked. And, I was sitting in the middle of a podcast, boom. And so when we decided with my co-founder of Lemonada and I that we wanted to lean into this zeitgeist of loss and sadness with levity and humor and joy and highbrow production, podcasting made sense. She's a voice actress. She's an author. She's a theater director. So long story short, that's the how one goes from Wall Street lawyering to leading a podcast network.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your very personal story of losing your brother, which was the inspiration behind the first Lemonada podcast, Last Day. But I'm interested to know if you and your co-founder, Stephanie, considered other forms of media, or was it always podcasting as number one? And what was it about podcasting that drew you to the medium to explore the opioid crisis?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Nicole. So I started working for Crooked Media in May 2017. Stefano passed away very unexpectedly in October 2017. And in February 2018, it was my birthday. And if you've experienced loss, like any milestone is just a shit show. You're like dreading it. You're like, the first time I'm going to eat a hamburger since my brother died. The first birthday, all of it. You're like, ugh. And I live in Minnesota. And if you're in Australia, you have no idea what I'm talking about when I talk about cold. Like, I know it gets windy and it gets like chilly occasionally, but like Minnesota's, we're in the North Pole here. February 26th, it's winter in Minnesota. It's my birthday. It's 2018. And I had saved an episode of a podcast called Terrible Thanks for Asking, which is a grief podcast from Nora McInerney. It's one of the best out there, full stop.
I've heard it. It's fantastic.
It's fantastic. And she's fantastic. And I had discovered it through another friend who was grieving. And she's actually based out of Minneapolis too. And so I saved this podcast. It was episode 12. The podcast was relatively new. Episode 12 was a sister who had lost her brother to a heroin overdose. And I was like, cool, I'll save this for my birthday because that's normal. Like, that's what she, like, and had been out for months. I just wasn't going to listen to it until I needed it, right? So I bundled up and went for a walk and popped my earbuds in, hit play. And it was truly the first time I like smiled since my brother had died. And I could feel my face in this freezing cold, like laughing. And I'm listening to this hilarious woman charm me through this podcast. And I think I listened to it a few times. I sat on it for a couple of days and then I thought, let me email her. She had a book out called Everything is Horrible and Wonderful about losing Harris, her brother. The woman was Stephanie Wittels Wachs, who is my co-founder of Lemonada. She lost her little brother, Harris Wittels, who was like, Sarah Silverman called him the funniest man who ever lived. He invented the word humble brag. He wrote Parks and Recreation. He wrote Master of None. He won an Emmy after his death. He died at age 30, alone in his house, coming out of rehab in Los Angeles. And it was 2 years out from Harris's death that Stephanie had published this book and was talking about it on Seth Meyers and this podcast that I heard. And I had no idea. I didn't know who Harris was. I was just like, sister, dead brother, same person, both went to NYU, got to know her, don't know why, cosmic. And I emailed her from my Pod Save the People email address. And I was like, listen, Dore, who on the show has also had lots of familial things happen with him and addiction. Both his parents are in recovery and we wanted to do more first-person narratives. I was like, come on the show. Like, just come on Pod Save the People. And she was like, I totally want to. I'm about to have a baby, like TBD. And we ended up continuing to talk and just hit it off in every sense, creatively, business-wise, friend-wise. And Stephanie is a 20-year voice actress veteran. She's like, if you listen to American anime, she's like the star of all of them. She went to NYU. She went to Tisch. She studied theater. She's a theater director, theater teacher, and a best-selling author. And I was in audio, and we were like, path of least resistance to creating these intimate moments where people can laugh and process hard things together is audio. It's less expensive. It's more intimate. You definitely want to listen to someone talking about something hard while you're walking around or cleaning your house or driving, and you don't want to have to sit there and stare at it on the screen. And so it was like strategic. It was also just what we knew. And here we are. We started creating our first show, Last Day, which is a narrative series that zooms in on someone's last day of life and then zooms out to try to help people understand a broader epidemic, where we did My Brother's Last Day in season 1. And then season 2, the suicide epidemic. And season 3, we're in production now on the gun violence epidemic. Obviously got a lot of American issues in there, but global to some extent too. But as we were making that show, we were like, you know what? The world is incredibly challenging on a number of fronts. Let's create humor and joy and community and help people through it, even the hardest things.
They do say that laughter is the best medicine. So
Yeah.
moving on, the motto behind Lemonada is turning lemons into lemonade, one podcast at a time. And you delve into some pretty ugly and dark sides of life. But you also say that you want your listeners to stop living their best life and start living their real life. How did you know this would resonate so well with your audiences, and why is it so important to you?
Oh, man. So I'll paint a picture. So I heard Stephanie in 2018. I had to grind her down to agree to work with me because she was like, I don't want to talk about Harris. I don't want to talk about his death, and I don't want to talk about opioids anymore. And I was like, yeah, but like opioids are killing more people than car crashes. And she saw that article and that headline, and it got better, and now it's gotten even worse in the pandemic. And, we're both activists at heart. And we met for the first time in February 2019, like months after we'd been emailing and talking and conceptualizing the show. And we did some market research at that time, and like people were miserable across the world in 2019. It's hard to remember that you were miserable before COVID, but statistically speaking, you were lonely, depressed, isolated, stressed, like all of it. And there was tons of good audio out there. We were consuming a lot of it, news and comedy and other stuff, but there was nothing that was like really feeding people's souls. So we just saw that there was an opening there, that like you could really just talk about what was content and community to help people get through hard things. We talk a lot about making life suck less now. And, it's not just opioids, gloom and doom. It's also, we have a podcast called Good Sex that is wildly popular, that is incredibly inclusive and like joyful and like celebratory around like, you should feel good. You get to feel good. Like you're going to die. So why would you be fucking miserable between now and then? So, we saw that market research then, and then like COVID hit, and it was like, oh, not just statistically likely that you're miserable, but you are miserable. Whether you live in Kenya or Brisbane or New York, you're miserable. So let's be in this together. And, our numbers just kind of shot through the roof. We thought we'd have 6 shows in about 18 months. We have 20. We thought we'd have a staff of 10. We have 40. And it's really just feeding a need to both help people through stuff and make things a little bit more joyful. And also like brands being like, where are the people we can help with our product or with our services? So there's just been a lot of, kind of fervor around it. And it's a cool gig, I got to tell you, because, our core values at Lemonada are we're mission driven, we're empathetic, and we're honest. And the mission driven piece, like we just attract a lot of people who are like, I want to work hard, but like I want it to mean something. And we have the privilege of doing that every day.
But it's also really important to know your audience and give them what they want. How do you find out what people want to hear next?
I don't know. People should email us, hey@lemonadamedia.com. All across the world. We just put a show out in Italy. It's the #1 podcast right now. It's called In Giro con Fra. And we want to open up into new markets. Like, we're miserable in America. You all know that from reading your news cycle. But you know what? You're miserable in Australia, and you're miserable in Italy, and you're miserable in India. You're miserable everywhere. So how do we produce audio that like you hop out of bed in the morning, you pop your earbuds in, you feel like a lot better or a little better? Either one is fine with us. We're happy with a little better. So you guys tell us if you have ideas. But we talk about reading the room a lot and trying to anticipate what's happening in the zeitgeist that we would need to create content for at the moment versus like maybe 6 months or a year from now. So I'll give you 2 concrete examples. One is In the Bubble, which is one of our big shows. It's a coronavirus podcast, but it's really hopeful and helpful and clarifying and nonpartisan. Andy Slavitt, who just left the White House on his 2nd stint there, this time helping with COVID communications around the vaccine rollout, emailed Stephanie, and he knew about us from Last Day, was like a huge fan of the show. And he emailed us on a Saturday about 2 weeks into the pandemic and was like, I want to do a podcast, but I want it to be like Fred Rogers for people, or Winston Churchill. Like, here's what's happening. Here's what you need to know. Here's how to stay safe. Here's how to talk to your friends. And we were like, a podcast that's super health specific. We're like, is that on brand? But the idea that it would be helpful to people at a time of need was like a yes. That show was up by April 6th. So he emailed us on March 28th at night. April 6th, the show was up and out. It was named one of the top podcasts of 2020. And it was like, read the room, step up, be there. Don't be like, coronavirus, it's going to kill you. But more like, okay, it might, but like, here's how we can get through this together. And then separately, we saw a different thing happening. We have this podcast last day that we've talked about where it's like, when things go horribly awry systemically, lots of people are dying. How do we understand that? How do we keep people safe? How do we reduce harm to people when they're dealing with mental health issues or addiction issues or gun violence epidemic? But if you go upstream, you're like, well, how the hell do we prevent that from happening? How do we not have health epidemics that we could prevent? And so we just launched a show this fall called New Day, which is like the yin to last day's yang. It's like you wake up in the morning and things are mostly fine, but you're lightly dreadful. How do you feel slightly better? You're like, I don't want to get out of bed because I know what my calendar looks like, or I know what is expected of me. So you're not dealing with a heroin addiction or a mental health massive crisis, or, you're not worried that you're going to die in community violence or a mass shooting. You're just like kind of sad and kind of bummed. How do we get people there? How do we help people create more joy? And we felt like coming out of this pandemic, even though we're sort of lightly crawling out of it, that in this fall, people would be craving something with more optimism. And so leaning into those moments, we're a new company. We're only 2 years old. So like, I don't have a 65-person R&D department that's running ideas by people. But if people in Australia email us, we will make your show. We will make your show that will make you happier. Okay? Calm down. We'll do it.
I'm going to email you after this.
Great.
Jess, you describe your podcast as first-person narrative, but you also use a range of formats from scripted narrative to shorter, unhosted, essay-style series like Good Kids and Good Sex. We tell our clients that a consistent host is important to build rapport with your audience. And I find that monologue or essay-style podcasts are often the hardest to stay engaged with. So what's the secret to making this format work so well for Lemonada?
Yeah. So first-person narratives is sort of narrative doesn't mean like the podcast is a This American Life narrative docuseries. It means like we're going beyond the headlines. We're not like 75,000 people have died of overdoses this year. We're like, this one person died of an overdose. Let's talk about that. And then let's zoom out and help you understand that 75,000 number. Or nobody on the planet is having good sex except the 12 people we found to come on our show. Let's learn from them. Because you're too embarrassed to tell your partner that you're bored out of your fucking mind, right? It's real. So we're going beyond the headlines. We're creating these platforms for very wildly diverse beyond your conception of diverse individuals to come together and just talk in various formats. The good vertical, as we like to call it, we have Good Sex, Good Kids, and Good Grief. And they're 10-minute shorts, sometimes 12, where we're just talking about topics. There's not a ton to say. Like, we want to create these moments. You're in the shower, Alexa, play Good Sex. Great. You shower, you got something to come back and bring to dinner conversation that night. Or just think about, just like, do I deserve to feel good? Nobody ever told me that. I think maybe I do. Okay, let me listen to 10 more episodes and then I'll convince myself. Or like Good Grief, 1 out of 500 Americans died of COVID in 18 months. So while everyone's grieving, 100% of people are grieving. That's not even the people who died of other shit, right? So we created 7 episodes called Good Grief. They're all 10 to 12 minutes, and it's an hour-long walk. And you're just, if you have lost someone and you don't know how to process it, here we are. We're here for you. And you get to hear other people's stories, and it's that community. It's that like, I am not alone. I am not the first person whose person has died. Wow. But we do tend to, especially in like Anglo societies, we tend to suffer silently. And why? For what? So that's our sort of space.
Well, we've discussed quite a bit on this season that narrative podcasts take a lot of resources to produce properly, but the effort can be well worth it for longer form storytelling that really stands out. Do you have a preference for one particular podcast format over another?
None whatsoever. We're a full service network. So at Lemonada, we do everything. Conceptualizing of idea, if there's partners, bringing on partners. Most of our shows are originals, but sometimes we work with production partners. We greenlight them, we monetize them, we market them, we distribute them, we create the art for them. Like literally everything is done in-house. We have some contractors, but composers are the same 5 composers we use for all of our shows. So our preference in terms of format is we're sort of agnostic. We're like, how do we tell this story? How do we fund this story? How do we market the story? And how do we effectively distribute the story? If we know we need to lean into something that's tied to the news cycle, then we're not going to do a narrative podcast about it. Or we're going to do a short, limited run, and then we're going to follow it with a weekly series if that audience develops well. If we know something is just topical, ongoing, evergreen, sex, kids, grief, right? Well, we can do it however we want, and we don't really need a host for it. We are not sort of tied to any particular format. It's like, how do we tell the best story, and how do we make sure that it makes sense in every regard?
And it does make sense. Yeah. I've heard you say that Last Day has had millions of downloads, which is fantastic. But can you take us back to the start? What have been the most effective marketing activities you've used to grow your audience?
Oh, gosh. When we were looking into Last Day and creating it, we knew there was no competition for this particular type of show. So we were filling a void. And we knew if we could just find people who were affected by the opioids crisis, they'd be amped to subscribe because we were our market. If that show had existed, our brothers might still be alive. And that's the central question of the show. Could we have saved them? So we took out billboards. We ran radio ads in Middle America. We had people on the Apple Podcast app writing, being like, I heard your ad on the radio as I was driving, and I had to pull over. It's the first podcast I've ever listened to. I had to figure out how to download the podcast app and find it because my son is struggling with heroin addiction, and I need to know what the hell you're going to say on the show because I am at my wit's end. And that times millions.
What about for shows now? Is there a particular marketing strategy that works across your slate of shows?
Dude, I wish, man. I wish. People are like, what's the silver bullet? And I'm like, do a lot of things well. Do all the things really well and hope that 1 or 2 of them work exceptionally for that particular show, but you have to do it all well every single time. And then you have to make a show people want to listen to. So I'm really sorry to deliver the bad news, but like the content has to be good. Otherwise, people will listen once and they're out. Like, we're busy. I'm busy. If your show sucks, I'm not going to listen to it again. And we know that. And I'm not saying every single thing we produce is amazing, but like we know if the quality is high, relatively high, listeners are forgiving. If the content is good and the audio quality is a B-, fine. If the audio quality is amazing and the content is a B-, harder to justify. So, we try to do all the things well from production all the way through making the marketing make sense.
Yeah.
Jess, just to go back to your use of billboards, that's a significant ad buy. Yeah. Did you have a show sponsor or partner to help fund that activity?
No. There were a couple places where people have been really hard hit by opioids. Ohio and Boston were 2. My brother died in Boston, and we took out a digital billboard. The space was not actually that expensive in both Ohio and in Boston, and had people texting us, emailing us, and reporting back on Apple Podcast reviews that they saw the billboard and like pulled the car over. Same for the radio ads. Like, I don't want to text and drive, but I need to find this podcast because otherwise I'm going to forget. So when we launched before, we just had like a teaser up, sort of like not even a real full trailer. We put that up in June. The show didn't come out till September. We had tens of thousands of people just subscribing. And then a couple of people emailing us, be like, where's your podcast? And we had said, like, it's coming in September. Like, it was the plan. We were on track. But, we were a brand new network, and we wanted to put ourselves out there and make sure people knew it was coming. So, yeah, the demand was high from the start.
Yeah, you've hit the mark when people are banging down the door to get your episodes before you've even launched. So that's
totally, yeah.
It's sad that was the topic that had them banging down the door.
Yeah, I mean, it's super bittersweet, but like then people are writing in on like, if it weren't for the show, my person would be dead. And you're like, okay, that's what we were trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, final question, Jess. It's been a hell of an 18 months, which we've spoken about. People really are doing it tougher than ever. And you've responded, as you've said, with the series Good Grief, which is short stories that help listeners process the grieving process. What topics are you going to tackle next?
True crime is really big in podcasting. And we always said we never do true crime because it's always like, woman gets murdered. She was perfect. Who would murder her? I'm not saying we're not here for it. Like, we will listen to that shit. We are basic. We will listen to whatever it is. We'll listen to the Rewatch podcast. We're not highbrow humans, but, it's not particularly on brand to be like, perfect victim. What happened? And then we got a pitch come to us from our partners at Spiegel and Grau. It's a new literary house. And it's called Believe Her. And the woman is not, she's the victim. She's the victim of a decade of domestic violence, but shot and killed her partner, turned herself in. And she's serving, a pretty long sentence in jail right now, estranged from her children. So it is a true crime series, but it is totally flipped on its head. And it really hones in on domestic violence and the toll it takes on families and why women can't get themselves out. We've got a fictional series that is around teens and consent that comes out at the end of the year. So it's another issue we're tackling. It's tons of levity and humor. It's got June Diane Raphael, W. Kamau Bell, Ron Hubel. It's going to be an awesome show. And then next year, in addition to all the stuff we've got going on, we're talking about burnout. We're continuing with the childcare crisis in America. Andy's show in the bubble is going to widen beyond the coronavirus pandemic to the many health epidemics we're facing on a day-to-day basis that impact our lives. Can we go outside with all the smoky air? Will we live in a burning garbage dump in 20 years? All this stuff. You may not be worried about it tomorrow, but you're worried about like the next day. And some other cool stuff happening. Last Day Season 3 on gun violence. We've got a series on the education crisis in America coming out early in the year as well.
Wow, you are certainly going to be busy, Jess, but they sound like fabulous shows. I look forward to listening to them. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Podcasting Essentials, and all the very best for Lemonada.
Definitely. Jess, thank you. Your take and your perspective on all the shows that you're doing is really refreshing and progressive, and it's just a nice angle to pop on the earphones and listen to something really meaningful and have a bit of a laugh as well. So thank you.
Thank you both. Thanks for having me.
Wow, they really are turning lemons into lemonade at a cracking pace.
Yes. Gosh.
But it goes to show that if you come up with the right concept for a podcast that either doesn't exist or is unique, or best still is both of those, and it fills a void for people, so in other words, gives them something that they really need, or perhaps they didn't even know they need, then you're on the right track to growing a large audience and can do so quite quickly.
Yeah, starting a network with a podcast about the opioid crisis sounds pretty grim, but clearly there's a need for it. And isn't it wonderful how many people it's actually helped? And that has shot them into a whole range of topics that the vast majority of us don't discuss enough, but we should. The similarities are actually really strong to the Crooked Media Network, which we discussed in episode 14 of this season, Nick, when we spoke with Sandy Gerard. They also found their own niche in progressive political commentary and, like Lemonada, are growing a passionate fan base.
And what I love too is that Lemonada has grown their audience from scratch. They weren't a huge brand with a massive audience at the waiting, which, as we've discussed, is a huge advantage if you have it. But again, they've proved that marketing will work if you have the right content. And Nicole, you mentioned billboards in the interview. They're not something that we often see when amplifying podcasts. But again, it was the nature of the topics that had cars stopping on the freeways to take note.
Exactly. And there's a huge lesson there, Nick. To all podcasters listening now, don't produce something that just you think is interesting. Dig deep into the minds of your target audience and discover what they want to hear, what they might not even know yet that they actually need to hear.
And hopefully you find it interesting as well.
Exactly.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me.
It's been another great episode. Thank you, Nick.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at SoundCartelAU. From the team at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.